Episode 6. A Boy Named Airadin. I met the woman who would be Airadin's mother about 350 years ago, while I was still wandering around the wild tribal regions of northern Galita. Of course, this was before the unification war that united the fractured city-states of Galita proper, that then united all of Galita through vicious bloodshed. But that's a story for another time. Linram waved his hands before his face, as if to shoo away the memories, before he reached into his voluminous robes and produced his small pipe, from which he began slowly smoking as he continued his story. Her name was Riza. I first met her when she saved my sorry hide from a ravenous pack of wolves. They had just about backed me into a corner, circling and getting ready for the kill, when here comes this blur of a woman, as beautiful as dawn's first rays falling through the canopy of a forest, swirling in with a wicked curved blade held gracefully in her hands. She made that sword sing so beautifully, I do believe I fell in love with her that very moment. When I thanked her for saving me, she gave me a look up and down that made me feel like an insect, unworthy of her scrutiny. She didn't even talk to me that first day, simply turned and walked away. I followed. I'd like to say I followed her because I was enamored with her already, consumed with an avaricious hunger to discover more about this enigmatic woman, but part of me also realized that the wolves probably had not gone far, and would simply return the second the threat of this woman vanished into the foliage. Either way, I scrambled after her, and followed her to her camp nearby. I gathered that she was a hunter-warrior for one of the many tribes of nomads who called the northern steppes home, though the fact that the tribe had sent a woman out to hunt narrowed the possibility of which tribe it may be. She wasn't, thrilled that I followed her. She gave me a look that nearly made me evacuate my bowels, but when I stood my ground, admittedly more out of fear than determination, her gaze softened, and she allowed me to join her around the campfire. That began a long period of happiness for me. I roamed and hunted with Riza until she returned to her tribe. It was the beginning of winter, so I spent the cold months with the tribe, who welcomed me once I used my will magic to show I was useful. I did things like drawing groundwater up to the surface, a relatively easy task once I mastered the technique, and putting up a temperate dome, which I used to heat the area around the camp, making the winter far more bearable. That was a good education for myself as well, seeing as I would later refine that technique to make my security perimeters and other warding magics that have been infinitely useful to me. Anyways, come spring, when the tribe prepared to roam once more, I convinced Riza to travel with me instead. The two of us traveled all over Galita together, falling in love the whole way. We spent a decade exploring in each other's company. It was magical. All of that changed when the Unification War broke out. Seeing as the land of my birth was fighting to unify all of Galita under a single banner and end the centuries upon centuries of needless fighting, I wanted to be a part of it, to fight with my countrymen. Riza disagreed. She felt that the century I had spent away from my homeland, as well as the decade I spent in her company, superseded any loyalty I had towards them. She argued that I should forsake the bloodshed sweeping across the land and return to the steppes with her, to be in peace with her people. We argued mightily. Days we fought over that issue until finally she stopped fighting. She just acknowledged what I was saying, gathered her belongings, and said farewell, hoping that one day I would find my way back to her. Had I known she was pregnant at the time, the choices I made would likely have been very different. At least, I hope that would have been the case. Riza returned to her people, and I went to war. Linrim paused and wiped tears from his eyes. It was another 10 years before I found out what became of Riza. She made it back to her people, 6 months pregnant and without me. And while I was ripping out throats and soaking the earth with blood, Riza gave birth to Airadin. He paused and stifled a sob. It was a difficult labor, and Riza was already heartbroken. She died giving birth to our son. Silence claimed the room for several long moments as Linrim softly cried. He took a deep breath and continued. I have no idea how long the tribe had been trying to get a hold of me. I was deep in the war effort, and not only was I constantly mobile, my exact location was kept secret. Which is why it took 10 years before one of their letters finally got through. The second I received the news, I relinquished my command, exited the front lines, and made my way straight for the steppes. Though the distance was considerable, I made the journey in weeks, barely sleeping and moving as fast as I could possibly push myself and my steeds to go. When I arrived, I found it not surprising at all to be greeted coldly, with near hostility. The tribe did not forgive me for abandoning Riza to go participate in a war that they too believed had nothing to do with me. They also did not believe I had no knowledge of Riza's pregnancy. Thus my abandonment was akin to betrayal. There were only two things that had worked in my favor. I had indeed come as soon as I received word, clearly exhausted from pushing myself on the journey, and there was no doubt that I was Airadin's father. The tribe gave me a choice at that point. I could either take Airadin from the tribe and raise him myself, or I could forsake my parental rights and leave Airadin in the care of the tribe, never to return or send word again. I knew that Airadin would never forgive me for taking him from his people, but I couldn't let the last piece of Riza I had slip through my fingers. I couldn't just turn my back on my own flesh and blood and walk away. I couldn't. So I took Airadin. And Airadin never forgave me. The tribe made it very clear that Airadin was welcome to return whenever he wanted. But I was never to set foot in their tribal lands again, on pain of death. So every other year, Airadin would spend a couple months with his tribal family, and the rest of the time he was under my care. From the moment we left the tribe and traveled to Galita, I recognized Airadin for the immense potential he had. The depth of his well was nearly imperceptible, and even without proper training, he had already begun to widen its width. His intrinsic understanding of will magic was incredible. Though he had just begun his formal training later than most, at 10 years old, by the time he completed our 5-month journey home, he had already gained the proficiency of an apprentice of his age. Airadin is a natural-born will mage. He can intuit will magic to a degree that even I have difficulty following. The first 10 years of his tutelage was incredible to witness. His growth was astonishing, and it did not take long before he was able to take on adept and even advanced level castings. It was around that time that the two of us built Twilight Chateau. And it was also around that time that everything began to change. Airadin was 20 years old, and he felt he was ready to begin traveling on his own, building his magic and finding his own niche where he could build a customer base, as I had with my alchemy in the surrounding villages. In hindsight, I recognize that Airadin only wanted to get out from underneath my scrutiny. He wanted to expand his magic, and he felt that I would stand in his way. Because I would have. When Airadin began traveling, he began experimenting with magics I would consider abhorrent. He began overriding will. Linram paused and took a deep breath before he continued. There is a reason that I taught you the tenets of will magic the way that I did, Rabbit. There is also a reason why I call them tenets and not laws. The tenets are guidelines, not uncrossable boundaries. The first tenet, will magic cannot be exerted on those that have a will of their own. In other words, you cannot cast on living creatures, for even the smallest rodent has a will of its own, however small and feeble. What Airadin discovered, as many before him had, is that this is fundamentally not true. It is indeed possible to cast upon living creatures. However, in order for the casting to be successful, the caster must completely overwhelm the will of the target. Doing so will likely destroy the mind of the target, making them essentially puppets to the caster's will, an extension of their power. The danger in this comes if the caster is unable to overwhelm the will of the target. In those instances, death is certain for both. And considering that it is incredibly difficult to ascertain just how much will any one creature possesses, it is exceedingly dangerous to attempt overriding will. But Airadin is special. His well is vast, and his will is ironclad. His intrinsic understanding of casting and will magic makes his castings more intricate and more powerful. I speculate that while he was making familiars... I speculate that he was making familiars within a year of leaving the walls of the chateau. Animals that he will-jacked and forced into servitude. These creatures were not like our friend Eris the Eternal Cat, who was simply changed by her long years of exposure to advanced will castings, and possesses a will of her own. These creatures were slaves to Airadin's will. They did whatever he desired. I don't know when exactly he began practicing on humans. I speculate it was when I started crafting Raquel, the second most powerful artifact I've ever created. It took me nearly a century to craft the sword, so it would be no wonder why I missed what must have been the ever-growing and ever more apparent signs of his expanding malice. it is likely that he took advantage of my distracted state to further his goals. I can guess all I want, but the truth is, I have no idea what Airadin did for the century it took me to craft Raquel. I wish I had never crafted that sword. Linram paused and wiped tears from his cheek. Regardless of why or how, shortly after I finished Raquel, Airadin struck. I don't know if he always planned to take the artifact from me, or if he took it in lieu of killing me. He showed up at the chateau one night in wonderful spirits. The two of us came to this very study and shared a drink together, commiserating over our recent accomplishments. I was such a fool. I gloated over the sword, showed it to him, explained everything it was capable of. And when I finally broke my eyes away from Raquel and looked at him, I saw the raw hunger that was there. He struck, hitting me with powerful binding magics I had not anticipated. Even if I had, I was so drained from the completion of Raquel, I wouldn't have had the strength to fight him off. He planned it perfectly. He seized Raquel from me. He then told me what he had been up to over the century. How he had figured out how to will jack a human being. How the first several attempts had nearly killed him, and had not produced quite the results he had been hoping for. Then he thanked me, because with Raquel in hand, the magic became trivial for him. You see, the sword is an amplifier. Any will you feed into the sword will grow exponentially, depending on how long you allow it to. It is also the closest thing to living will. It is so deeply woven with will that the sword itself has its own understanding of magic. It has become a manifestation of will. The sword does not itself live, but anyone holding that sword could cast any number of powerful castings without worry of exhaustion and without the need to make contact with one's third eye. The sword is such a powerful conduit that simply touching it is enough. Linram blew out a breath and seemed to deflate slightly, sagging back into his chair. He went to draw on the pipe and discovered it was cold, the cherry long burned out. Frowning, he relit the pipe and drew on it once more, blowing out a dense cloud of smoke. He took Raquel, and within weeks, he had all the people of the steppes bowing to him. I do not know how many of these peoples of the north he had to will jack, and how many simply acknowledged his superiority, and thus his innate right to lead them. Regardless, from that moment forward, he began coalescing his power. He turned the nomadic peoples of the north into a settled people, wholly devoted to warcraft. In the centuries since, the might of the north has begun to compare equally to the might of Galita, despite Galita being far larger. Because after Galita unified, no one wanted to war anymore. The bloodshed was so intense. Peace became a cornerstone of the people afterwards. The militias were disbanded, and only the royal army maintains any sort of standing force. Even so, as the power of the North grew, I did my best to inform the royal family to the growing threat. It took a couple of generations before they listened to me. By that time, I had already constructed the bulk of this web and was keeping a very close eye on Airadin. Once I convinced the royal family to bulk up their defenses and at least entertain the possibility of an invasion from the north, Airadin caught wind of it. I don't know how, and honestly, it doesn't matter. Once he realized what I was doing, he also realized that I had been using the web of tracking to keep tabs on him. That was when he began actively blocking me. I've tried working with the royal family ever since, but the latest iterations of the Patriarch are more interested in bringing me to heel, trying to enlist me into their ranks. Linrem scoffed. Like I would ever serve under another again. Not after the Unification War and all that it cost me. If you were wise, Rabbit, you would do well to avoid the royal family at all cost. At least until you're powerful enough to stand up to the king. But you don't have to worry about that while your tutelage continues. They wouldn't dare approach one of my apprentices while they are still under my wing. So wait, Ravenel said, breaking his silence for the first time since his master had begun his tale. Was that what that was in the village a few days ago? With that Dirkley guy? Yes and no, Linrem said with a frown. Dirkley was the last to attempt to forcibly recruit me, but that was not the goal of his visit. He came to give me another piece for the web, in the hopes that it may once again unlock the ability to see Airadin's movements with clarity. Not that it did, of course. Airadin is incredibly clever. Ever since he learned of the web, he warded himself thoroughly. He even went as far as to ward his top lieutenants against my magics. I have been unable to unearth anything capable of circumventing his wards. Thankfully, Airadin seems content sitting up north and biding his time. For now. As for the effectiveness of the web, it's still tied in with Airadin enough to function as a proximity alarm, as I have stated. We will know if and when Airadin crosses Galita's northern border. Until then, there's not much else we can do. But Master, Ravenel asked, more than a little disconcerted, how are we supposed to stop Airadin? Linrem preferred a sorrowful smile. We don't. With Raquel in his possession, Airadin is the strongest will mage alive. There's no way anyone would go toe-to-toe with him and walk away breathing. Without recovering Raquel or creating an artifact of equal or greater power, I don't think there's a way to defeat Airadin. And considering what happened the last time I created an artifact of exemplary power, I refuse to construct another. So what? Ravenel asked. We just sit and wait for him to grow strong enough to force his will upon the world? No, Linrem answered. Thankfully, there is a limit to will jacking. Due to the extreme nature of completely taking over another's mind, the target mind is completely wiped, as I mentioned already. What I didn't mention is the fact that this wipe also takes out any instinctual tasks we are consumed with on a daily basis. While he doesn't necessarily have to remind his targets to keep breathing and circulating blood, he does have to remind them to care for themselves. If he doesn't, they starve, soil themselves, and generally begin to rot away. And, of course, Once a mind is wiped, it's gone. So the more minds he is forced to overtake, the more of his power that will be solely allotted to keeping them alive. Which is why I wonder just how much Airadin had to flex in order to convince the tribes of the north to follow him. Really, he didn't have to do much. He's a son of the steppes, already one of their people, and by far the strongest of them all. By the customs of the steppes, he is due whatever he decides to take by force. If the tribes acknowledge him as a superior leader, he may not have had to wipe many minds at all. They could simply fall in line behind his growing numbers. I don't understand, Ravno said, shaking his head. So he conquered the north because he's charismatic? Doesn't that make him more dangerous and not less? In order to dominate the mind of another, a certain proximity is needed, Linrem said. He needs to be close enough to make solid eye contact with his target. So as far as his ability to willjack, I do not fear that we have an existential threat there. It would be beyond irrational for him to choose to willjack a populace over simply having his forces overwhelm them with violence. He has a massive standing army at his disposal, Rabineau. That is what I would fear. If Airadin were to get involved on the front lines, my concern would not be willjacking. I'd be consumed with simply staying alive. I didn't think will magic was very well suited for combat, Rabineau said, frowning. For most people, Linrim answered, it's not. It takes a vast majority of will mages all of their focus and abilities just to cast the most basic workings. For those of us with wells large enough and the capacity to fling higher level workings, combat is generally beneath our dignity. You fought in the Unification War, Ravenel said flatly. How's that for beneath your dignity? I fought because I believed, Lynn replied sadly. I believed in a world of peace. The message that was carried by all of the Unification forces. An end to the bloodshed, an end to the violence. I was foolish beyond comprehension, boy. I made that choice, and now look at what that choice has cost the world. When Airadin does decide to spread his dominion, because it is not a matter of when, not if. Because it is a matter of when, not if. It will be the people of Galita that suffer and die. I can't even pretend in my mind that I would stop him, stand in his way. Because I'm already doing that, Rabbit. And the truth is, when he decides to make his move, I will be the first piece he removes from the board. I'm far too dangerous. I know way too much. Just this web alone, Lynn gestured to the intricate working above them, contains more information about Airadin than anyone outside of his inner circle would even be privy to. His first task would be to eliminate me and any means I had of keeping tabs on him, i.e., this web, the chateau. He'd probably burn the whole valley to the ground just to be sure to raise any of my influence from the earth. That's reassuring, Ravenel said glumly. So what? There's absolutely no way of defeating Airadin? As the cards lie, Linrim said hesitantly. No. Ravenel sagged in his chair. Then what is even the point of all this? If Airadin is just going to come through and destroy everything. Not as long as I can help it, he won't, Linrim said sharply. And I said, as the cards lie. Why in the hells do you think I took you on as an apprentice, Ravenel? Ravenel felt the color leave his cheeks. Because I was a horrible pickpocket with an adorable smile? Not even close, Linrim snapped. Those may have been the circumstances that led to our paths crossing, But once I laid eyes on you, I knew you had the potential. I hadn't seen raw, latent power like that since the days of Airadin's childhood. But, Ravenel spluttered, he's like a savant. How in the hell am I supposed to rival that? Even without Raquel, Airadin would squish me like a bug. Linrem leaned forward. Oh, we are going to change that, Rabbit. The fire was back in his eyes, burning fiercely as he held Ravenel's gaze. We're going to wake up your power. Then we're going to get you started building your own artifact. Ravenel frowned. What? He said. Like Raquel? No, Linrem said with a wicked grin. Much, much better.